Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, where we are going to, alongside Employment Law Solutions, be covering the legal and practical considerations when it comes to furloughing employees through the COVID-19 pandemic, to the extent that we have the information. I'm conscious that we have a number of people joining us today who are not clients, and therefore I wanted to briefly introduce us before we begin. So, by means of an introduction, my name is Laura Sant and I'm a director of Carthy Accountants, which is a family-run accountancy practice in Stafford. To provide some context, whilst my surname is now Sant, I was actually born Carthy. After a tough week, for those who've already joined us at earlier webinar sessions this so far, I'm going to be providing Sally with a little respite today, and I'm going to be leading the question and answer section after the presentation. If you do have any questions that you would like answering in addition to the presentation, then please feel free to provide your questions through the question and answer section, the Q&A button that is on the bottom of your screen. And you can do that throughout the presentation. You don't need to wait until the end to send those through. In terms of who will be presenting, it will be my colleague Edith Woodward, who is one of our senior accountants, and she's going to be doing our section of the presentation. But before that, we are going to be joined by Alf Murphy of Employment Law Solutions, who is also part of a family business with his children Kevin and Jenny. Alf's got quite a varied background, being part of the police and a businessman before he was accepted to the bar in 2006 and was appointed a member of the Employment Tribunal in December 2019. So without further ado, in terms of what we're going to go through today, if Edith can just move the slide on, please. Thank you. So Alf is going to start us off in terms of explaining what furlough means, what furlough is, and who it's going to affect, before considering the legal implications to furloughing employees. Edith then's going to take over and look at the calculations and what Carthy Accountants and Employment Law Solutions can do to help you in this particular situation. And then we'll finish off with a question and answer session at the end. I think the plan is that we'll take about half an hour to 40 minutes doing the webinar itself, and then we'll leave plenty of time at the end to answer any questions that people may have. I'd certainly know that in our earlier webinars of this week, the majority of the questions were in regards to the furloughing situation. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Alf and we'll get started. Thanks.
Laura, you just need to unmute Alf because he can't be heard at the moment.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. I'm unmuted now. My wife's been trying to do that for 40 years to no avail. Good afternoon. Thank you to that for that introduction from Laura. Right, strap in and buckle down, everyone. It's Friday afternoon. It's 3:30, and here's your law lecture. I'm going to discuss furlough, where it came from, who it applies to, the conditions and the risks involved, and finally, how it affects annual leave and sick pay. The vast amount of our inquiries by telephone and email over the last 2 weeks or more have been on furlough, and we've always been careful to preface our advice with the following important information. Ordinarily, Parliament would scrutinise proposed legislation for weeks, if not months. The House of Commons would pass it up to the House of Lords, who would discuss and make amendments, send it back to the House of Commons for final drafting before the Queen would give her assent, and it would become an Act of Parliament. In this case, there's no legislation on furlough. There's no law for us to advise on. Instead, teams of civil servants have worked hard to come up with 3 guidance notes. They've worked hard, they've had to do a lot in a short space of time, and they provided guidance for employers, guidance for employees, and some public health guidance. I have to say that some of the guidance is slightly ambiguous in parts, and other parts are even slightly contradictory. So the guidance is open to interpretation at the moment. It'd be nice if we had law, but I don't actually think we're going to see any law by the time you need to furlough your staff. So furlough, what is it? It's a completely new concept in English and Welsh law. It's technically known as the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. That said, the term furlough has become the accepted term and everybody is using it. Furlough is a period of leave granted to employees for which the employers can reclaim a contribution to wages from the government. How cool is that? The most asked question of the month has to be, how can I get the government to pay my staff wages? We've heard it time and time again. Will furlough apply to your organisation? I can hear you ask. Let me tell you which organisations furlough does apply to. Any organisation within the UK can apply for this assistance. Limited companies, partnerships, sole traders, any businesses, charities even, and recruitment agencies where they use agency workers paid through the PAYE scheme. Now you know which organisations can apply for this assistance. Who of your employees can be designated as furloughed employees? Well, let me tell you, full-time employees, part-time employees can be furloughed, employees and workers on flexible contracts or even 0 hours contracts can be placed on furlough leave. Employees on agency contracts is mentioned in the guidance. I have to say we require some further guidance on that because it's an unusual term, employees on agency contracts. You'll all know, I'm sure, that employees work under contracts of employment. So if you have a specific inquiry about agency workers, or if you're involved in an employment business, I'm afraid time-wise, we're going to have to deal with them separately from this afternoon. Let me move on to look at what conditions are placed on the designation of furloughed employees. Your employees can be placed on furlough leave for blocks of at least 3 weeks at a time. This would infer, I'm sure you'll agree, that employees can be placed on furlough leave, but then taken off again should the needs of the business require it. For example, a sudden order was to come in that needed somebody to run to the warehouse and do some picking. The inference is the same, that the employees taken off furlough leave can be put back onto it again, of course, in the blocks of 3 weeks. The most important condition on furlough, and it's the word we all want to know about, it's the money word. The condition is that employers have to pay the lower of £2,500 per month, or 80% of the usual monthly salary as a minimum. As a minimum. That means you can, if you were so inclined, make an enhanced payment. But furlough will entitle your employees to £2,500 or 80% of the usual salary, whichever is the lower. Another important condition on furlough for the employees is that they cannot undertake any work whilst they're placed on furlough leave. They can do training if necessary, and there are some minimum wage conditions attached to that, which I know Edith will tell you about later. Importantly, and as oddly as it sounds, we've had a lot of queries about volunteering. Employers are saying, then, can they get their employees to volunteer while they're on furlough leave? And the answer is no, they can't volunteer if it provides services to or generates a revenue for the employer or his organisation. Otherwise, it can volunteer. So, now that we know something about it, who can we furlough? Can we furlough anyone? The whole concept of furlough is that it's aimed at those employees who would otherwise have been laid off or had their employment contracts terminated. These are the employees who you can designate as furlough employees. Whilst the government has been magnanimous as to pay 80% of wages, it's also introduced another very interesting point. Recently made redundant employees can be re-employed and then placed on furlough, especially if they're re-employed as of the 28th of February 2020. Apart from the big word furlough being used as much as it is nowadays, I'm sure some of you will have noticed Martin Lewis appearing on social media and in the press and even on national television. He, of course, is the king of consumer credit inquiries. He's passionate and he's forceful, we all know that. And he's putting some pressure on employers to reinstate recently made redundant employees. You don't have to do it. Don't feel pressured by him. You can do it, but you don't have to do it. So now that we know something about furlough, we're going to go to slide 2, and we'll discuss some of the risks involved. The most important thing you need to know as an employer is that normal contractual obligations continue to apply during periods of furlough leave. Where pay is varied, it must be done in accordance with the contract and usual employment law practices. And that means where the contract, if the contract allows for such a variation, fine. If the contract doesn't allow you to vary the wages, you need the employer's agreement to bring in a variation. And a failure to properly vary the contract of employment could see you at the wrong end of an unpaid wages claim, an unlawful deduction claim. Worse still, albeit it's only a theoretical risk, there is something of a risk of a constructive dismissal claim in varying contracts of employment without doing it properly. A more realistic risk, however, is the risk of discrimination. Employers need to be careful not to treat employees less favourably because of one of the protected characteristics, sex, age, ethnicity, and so on. Employers choosing to furlough staff, some staff, but not others, you'd be wise to adopt a selection criteria system, some kind of basic matrix, which would then allow you to demonstrate why it was that you chose certain staff over others. And it wasn't to do with one of the protected characteristics. Another element of discrimination is indirect discrimination. Now this involves a provision, criterion or practice which puts a group of people at a disadvantage. For example, old people. They'd be at a disadvantage if you decided to furlough old people. But we're being told the elderly need to stay at home. It is possible to prioritise the elderly or the vulnerable, and there is a statutory defence of justification that can be relied on. But please be careful and take advice as much as you can. I'm going to ask my friend to turn to slide 3, our last slide in this Friday afternoon session, well, from me anyhow. And it's about annual leave and other contractual terms. As an employer placing your staff on furlough leave, you need to understand that the other contractual terms in the contract remain in place. The only term you're varying, or correction, the only term that will be removed is the obligation on you to provide the employee with work and the obligation on him to do work. If you have staff, for example, with company car and a right to a personal use of that vehicle, then that will continue during furlough leave. The guidance as we know it is actually silent on annual leave, but as the scheme runs in conjunction with all current employment law, we can safely assume that annual leave is still accrued as normal during periods of furlough leave. I can say that with some confidence because one of the significant changes that has been made, and in fact that has been laid into law, is a change to the working time regulations of 1998. Employees are now allowed to carry over 4 weeks annual leave, and they can do that for 2 years. So the old concept that we used to talk about of use it or lose it is currently postponed. There are some conditions on this, and again, you should take advice. We haven't got time this afternoon to cover everything, but advice is available. One of the most often asked questions, again, over the last few weeks is, can I force my employees to take annual leave during periods of furlough? Well, the strict answer to that is yes, you can, because the working time regulations allow you as an employer to instruct workers to either take leave or in fact not to take leave at specific periods. But there's a way of doing it. So be careful and make sure we get it right. Another question that has come up is bank holidays. What happens to bank holidays during furlough leave? Because Easter is almost upon us and things will not have improved by then. With bank holidays, the position is those 8 statutory bank holidays form part of the annual leave balance, as I like to call it. They only form part of the annual leave that the employee is entitled to take over the full year. Nothing else. No great mystery about bank holidays. So if your company is closed on a bank holiday and the employee can't have it as a holiday because the company is closed, he's not otherwise supposed to be work, it's just a simple rest day. It's not an annual leave day. So whatever he's got in his annual leave bank will remain unchanged by the furlough days over Easter. I hope that's clear. Bank holidays is often a source of problem for employers. The question of pay whilst employees are off because of this coronavirus pandemic has become a complex issue for employers. Many employees are causing employers to consider a whole host of weird and wonderful scenarios. Statutory sick pay is or has become one of the biggest lines of inquiry we've had. Isolation notes are available from NHS 111 now, the online service. Employees don't have to go to a GP. It's a simple phone call or an application online, and they can be given what we call an isolation note. The government has introduced this flexibility into the system, and the expectation is that employers will reduce their requirement for medical evidence of incapacity, simply because it will ease the burden on the NHS. In a nutshell, to sum up the situation, employees who have developed personal symptoms, the recent cough and the high temperature, will get 7 days self-isolation covered by SSP. If there's a household member displaying symptoms and an employee has to self-isolate, they have to self-isolate 14 days and they'll get SSP. If personal symptoms then develop, again, we're getting this an awful lot. They've had 14 days because a relative has symptoms, somebody in the household, and now they've got their own symptoms, they want another 7 days off. Well, the guidance is slightly unclear on that, and our advice would be they should be asked to do the online service and get some kind of isolation note that way, or a fit note from the doctor. Those employees who are self-isolating without any symptoms because they think they're part of a vulnerable group, this is commonly now known as shielding. Well, they're not entitled to SSP, and they're not entitled to be put on furlough leave, and they're not entitled to pay. If they're choosing to shield because of someone they know is part of a vulnerable group and they don't have symptoms themselves, and so be it. Employees who think they are extremely vulnerable, and I use that term because that's in the definition, that's in the guidance, there's a definition to that. Those who think they're extremely vulnerable or have been told to self-isolate by the NHS with these letters that have been sent out or text messages, as long as they're self-isolating in line with public health guidance, and that guidance is quite specific again, they can be placed on furlough leave. So it's a complicated kind of system. And one of the confusing factors is those employees who want to self-isolate without symptoms so as to shield a relative who fits in with the category that can be furloughed. They're on their own, I'm afraid. Furlough doesn't apply to them. Sick pay doesn't. It is complicated. There is advice out there. And there was a famous Court of Appeal judge who was discussing holiday pay and overtime some years ago, and that was a popular topic, a hot potato. He said, luckily for me, I only have to tell employers what they have to do, not how to do it. And it's the same here, I'm afraid. We can only tell employers what they have to do. I'm going to hand you over now to an expert who will tell you how to do it, our friends and colleagues at Carthy Accountants. Thank you.
Thank you, Alf. So just very quickly again, before I start going over these calculations, because I'm aware how much of a hot topic this is, just a reminder, if you've got any questions, to just pop them in the Q&A section, which is at the bottom of your page. Try and avoid using the chat because they can get a bit lost between all the other things that are going on between the panelists. So if you're not sure where it is, just hover near the bottom of your screen and a little Q&A box will pop up. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of everything we've got so far in terms of the calculation side for furloughed employees. First of all, it's always based on the basic pay for your employees. You cannot include any bonuses, commissions or fees, which does mean those that are in the sales rep genre of being an employee, they are going to feel it a bit more as a pinch because they're usually commission heavy based for their monthly salary, but it is purely based on their basic pay. For those that are on salaried employees, they will have their February 2020 pay furloughed. So any pay rises that were due to come up, it will still be based on the February 2020 for the furlough calculation. Any employees that are varied hours, there's two different methods to calculate this now. The first one, which was originally published, was based on the average over the 2019-2020 tax year. So if they worked from April to March, you'd work out the average of their earnings per month and pay them that amount under furlough. However, HMRC and the government have now released that you can also look at, if they've worked for more than a year, how much they earned this time last year. So if you're working out the furlough calculation for April, it's what they would have earned in April 2019 can be furloughed for April 2020. The calculation that you would choose would be the higher of either of those methods. Now, the government will reimburse up to 80% of the gross wage as described further up. That will be limited up to £2,500. On my next slide, you will see more information about where those calculations come in, but you need to remember it is limited to 2,500 as Alf's already explained. The one thing that the government will also do on top of that, which is slightly different to the self-employed package that a lot of you may have heard, is they're also going to reimburse the additional employment costs that are associated with having an employee. The first one being they'll reimburse the employer NI of the amount for the revised gross wage. So it won't be 80% of the normal amount, it'll be the 80% of the gross wage amount. And exactly the same for the employer pension contributions. However, that will be set as the bare minimum employer contribution of the qualified earnings amount. So if as an employee you actually contractually pay more, then you'd have to look at whether you could do a variation to reduce that back down, or as an employer, that will just be an additional cost that you cannot get reimbursed by HMRC. The other thing you need to bear in mind on this is that you've got the reimbursement for 80% whilst you've got your staff furloughed. But as Alf alluded to, during this furlough period, your employees can do some training. But if they are doing training, you need to be aware that this furloughed amount, you have to make sure it meets national minimum wage for the hours that they've trained. Otherwise, national minimum wage doesn't come into the calculation for furloughing, it's ignored. It's just purely if they're doing any training during that time. So on this slide here, you'll see the concept of how much you'll be able to reclaim back from HMRC. It is based on the April 2020 rates, because obviously we're now in a new tax year. So that means that your national insurance levels differ and the qualified earnings levels differ as well. The important thing to note here is across the top, you've got what their average monthly salary would have been for each employee. The next column is the amount that would be furloughed, so the amount reimbursed by HMRC. Now, as already said, by law, you can choose to only pay that 80%, but you do need to vary the contract. And then you've also got here the national insurance that would kick in for any of the furloughed salary that HMRC will reimburse. You've got below that the employer pension contribution if your employee hasn't opted out. If they've opted out, obviously HMRC have nothing to reimburse you for, so they won't reimburse. But the main thing I wanted to draw your attention to is for the self-employed people that are out there, and if you want to see that webinar, it's available on our website now. But what you'll be aware of is they're allowed to claim up to $2,500 per month. But actually, the grant for the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme actually gives the employer up to £2,803.38 per month. So there's a slight deviation to what the self-employed element are able to get, but that is to help employers with the additional employment costs. You'll see this table doesn't go above 3,125, and that's because once you go above that, that's when the cap hits to limit you to the 2,500 that you can see on the screen. Be aware that as part of this, obviously you will pay the net pay to your employee direct, but the PAYE and tax is still payable to HMRC. You need to be aware that as far as we're concerned at the moment, the portal that they're creating, we don't know if it'll be advanced enough to realise that an element of it's PAYE, so therefore that means paying to your PAYE account and reimbursing you just the net amount. I suspect it won't be, because the amount of time they've been given to actually prepare this won't give them the capabilities to get that in place. Therefore, it's really important to use the money that you're reimbursed by HMRC for PAYE to actually pay that to HMRC's PAYE department. You cannot use it for your cash flow. I cannot see HMRC taking kindly when they've reimbursed you for those figures to actually go ahead and spend that on other things. I appreciate as a business you may have more important things to pay for, but it will be one of those things that HMRC, they're not going to take kindly to. They will query why they're giving you the money for the PAYE and you've not actually paid it. Just as a side note, apologies if you suddenly hear my 3-year-old daughter. I've just heard her made her way up the stairs. I am working from home. My husband should hopefully be able to keep her out of the room, fingers crossed. So apologies if we do have a slight interruption, but hopefully all will be good. Anyway, continuing on. Alf's already mentioned about the statutory sick pay. I'm not going to go into it in any detail, but what I do need to let you know is how that interlinks with the calculation for load workers and the actual payment systems. Any statutory payments, be that statutory sick pay or any statutory parental pay, they override any furlough payments. So if you have an employee who's on statutory sick pay, be that due to COVID-19 or another underlying sickness, then you have got the situation where you will continue paying them the statutory sick pay, and then at a future date when they would normally come back to work but there's no work available to them, you can then furlough them. There is the other side of the coin to that, that if they notify you that they're actually down with COVID-19 or sick, that technically you're meant to take them off the furlough system. But any situations like that, feel free to talk to ourselves or a HR specialists such as Alf to talk a bit more about that side of things away from the presentation, because it's a bit confusing and complicated. And if we're brutally honest, I don't know how many employees will actually notify their employer about that, because they will be out of pocket by going to statutory sick instead of being on their 80% furloughed amount. The other thing is any statutory parental pay, be that statutory maternity, statutory paternity, statutory adoption, or statutory shared parental pay. They override the furlough amounts, so you continue receiving your statutory payments, and you're already getting that to a certain extent funded by HMRC, so you won't get any additional through the furlough system, with the slight exception, and again for the statutory sick pay, that if you actually do a top up, so you pay additional under an occupational maternity, paternity or sick pay scheme, where you can actually take those calculations that you'd normally have for if that member of staff would be furloughed. So if you paid them up to their 50% of their salary rather than the statutory amounts, then you can use the differential between the statutory amount and the amount you'd normally pay and furlough that difference. In terms of whether you'd then only pay the 80% rather than 100% of the difference, that again would need to be a variation in contract. One thing to bear in mind is you cannot furlough any other statutory of the payment, so you cannot reduce any statutory maternity pay amounts due by the 80%, because that is protected and that can't be varied. That's just how it is, but you should get that reimbursed anyway. So the next thing everyone's asking us at the moment is what do you actually need to do to claim? First things first, it's a new portal, as I've described already, that HMRC are really busy trying to develop. I do know through an associate of mine whose parents work at the HMRC department, they are working night and day. It is a high priority for them. It is a frustration to employers around there because they're still having to fund their staff's furlough payment till they can reclaim it. But the actual civil service are working really hard to get this running for everybody. So we've just got to sit tight. I appreciate it's affecting everyone's cash flow. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail shortly. But there is that option out there that portal is coming, so we've just got to hang fire. They're going to ask for certain details, and so far what they've released is you're going to need the employer's name, PAYE reference, the claim period. Now bear in mind there's that 3-week minimum period in there, so they'll be monitoring how long you're taking it for. The amount claimed, your business bank details, your contact name, your contact telephone number, and the number of employees being furloughed. At this moment in time, the information on the government's website is suggesting it's looking at it as a whole rather than as individual employees, but the portal hasn't been designed yet, so, or at least released, I should say. So we don't know if it will then be broken down further to each employee. HMRC are reserving the right to retrospectively audit your calculation, so it's really important you keep hold of the calculations for the amounts that you're claiming under furlough, because HMRC are not going to look kindly on anyone committing fraud. This is a really, really detailed and a really generous system that the government have put in place. So we need to make sure that no one's abusing this. So HMRC, they're not going to take kindly to it. And as professionals, people aren't going to take very kindly to it either. You can only submit one claim at least every 3 weeks, but it can be backdated, your first claim, to the 1st of March or the latest of when you've had to stop work. So obviously, as we've already said, the furlough period can only be when your employees cannot physically work. So although we can backdate it to the 1st of March, if your employees were working until, say, the 11th of March, then that 10-day period cannot be furloughed, it'd be after that date. Once HMRC have accepted your claim, they will pay it direct into your business account because they're reimbursing the employer. They're not paying the employees, as we've already explained. Then they will also be accepting claims in accordance to the actual payroll that you've been paid, that you've paid out or are imminently about to pay. So again, it strengthens the fact that you're going to have to pay your employees before you can actually make this claim. Another stipulation is no fees can be deducted from the employee's pay for these calculations. I don't think it's common that happens, but it must happen from time to time for HMRC to strongly stipulate that. Once the scheme does cease, HMRC will finalise any final claims that are in there and then close the scheme. They won't just close it as soon as they decide that the scheme's ceased. Any existing claims that they're still processing will get finalised. So one of the big questions really runs around directors. Originally, our understanding before further clarification was given was that a director can't really be furloughed that easily, because without a director in a limited company, the limited company, it ceases to exist because you need that director to run it. However, whilst there's still nothing official in writing, and I was checking right at the start of this webinar that nothing's been suddenly released on us, there has been a representative from the Treasury called Ben Kerry, who held a CBI webinar on the 27th of March, who stipulated that directors could be furloughed, providing that they are only completing their statutory duties, which means that they won't be able to do any profit generating work. Now, the Companies Act 2006 has quite a broad stroke for what is a director's statutory duty. In particular, the duty is to promote the success of the company, and that they must act in a way that considers and in good faith ways to promote the success of the company for the benefit of its members, so that its employees, its customers, its suppliers, and the general community around that limited company. So that would mean that there kind of is a bit of scope there for being able to do some marketing to keep that business afloat and around, so everybody kind of really knows what's going on. Your business is still there and ready to go once this whole COVID pandemic has kind of calmed down a bit. The other thing I've shown on here is a table similar to the one you've seen in a previous slide. What you will see is these amounts are slightly different to what you've seen, and that's because for directors, we generally, of owner-managed businesses that is, we generally pay them a slightly different rate. The first rate that you can see here for 719 was the minimum amount you could pay a director without kicking in any national insurance in the 1920 tax year, but still contribute towards the stamp for their pension, so they get a year's qualifying pension stamp. Now, that rate will go up ever so slightly this month in April to 732. However, because it's based on February's payroll, you'll only be able to furlough the amount for 719. So the amount you'll get reimbursed from HMRC if you choose to furlough yourself would be 575.20 for each director. There's no national insurance on that. And generally for directors, we're finding the general scope is most directors opt out of the work-based pension scheme because there's a much more beneficial schemes available for them through companies. Obviously, we're not independent financial advisors to give that advice, but it's the general feeling that we get from directors. The other amount that you can see on the screen is this 1,042. That's the monthly amount for your basic allowance that you can pay before tax kicks in. Obviously, it differs if you've got other sources of income, but generally the 1,042 is what's paid because that's your basic allowance on a monthly basis. So if you were paid that last year, you'll be paid the same amount this year because our personal allowances haven't changed this year. So you'll get the 833.60 here reimbursed by HMRC. Directors' national insurances differ ever so slightly to standard employees, but for ease, I've just shown you if it was under a standard employee, and the amount of national insurance that would be on that would be the 42.78 on a monthly basis. So you can see HMRC will reimburse £876.38 on a monthly basis for those directors. Going on from there, the one thing we all need to consider when running our own business is the actual risk of furloughing yourself. By furloughing, you're not able to do any more work. You can't generate income for at least a 3-week period because that's the minimum time you can furlough yourself. But during that 3-week period, you may get contacted by a potential customer and you can't physically work and do anything for them. Now, if you turn around to them and say, really sorry, I could do the work in 2 weeks' time, there's nothing stopping them from contacting one of your competitors who hasn't furloughed, and they can then go and do that work instead of you. So you've suddenly lost some revenue. It's obviously a decision you need to make for yourself, and it's something that we can certainly talk to you about the pros and cons for your individual circumstances. but it's something you really need to consider quite strongly as a director. So we're now on to the next slide, really, which is all about how we can help. So I'm going to pass you back over to Alf to explain how they can help you, and then we'll come back to how we can help at Carthy Accountants.
Thanks, Edith. The most important thing to remember with this episode we're all going through is that contractual law ordinarily applies. Unfortunately, I have to say that we issue employment contracts regularly to clients and non-clients, and very often, sometimes even years later, and you all know who you are, we find them in a drawer or in a box not having been issued. Well, we need to get them issued. If you haven't got contracts of employment issued, we can help you to draft them. Once the contracts have been drafted and issued properly, we can help you with the variation documentation that you need in place so as to vary your contracts properly and safely. Most important that you stay safe. I'm saying that to you for health reasons, but I'm saying it to you for employment law reasons. We can help with contracts variations, and thereafter generally just ongoing employment law advice. We're happy to help, and we're quite a friendly service, much as Carthy's are too. So back to you, Edith.
Thank you. And just very quickly, because I completely forgot to mention it in my other slide, just so you're all aware, this furlough 80%, the Corona Job Retention Scheme grant, is taxable. So you will get taxed on any amounts that you're reimbursed by HMRC, but don't forget that income's being offset against the actual expenditure that you're having. So it's taxable, but it's not additional taxable to anything that you normally have as such. It's just going to be offset against the other one. But anyway, let me just get back to where I can actually help you rather than constantly informing you with lots of tax stuff. At Carthy Accountants, obviously, we operate a payroll bureau. We are here to help anyone that needs any help with their calculations, whether we do your payroll or not. And we can also help with the claim, again, whether we do the payroll or not. Outside of furloughing, we're also really strongly pushing the fact that we can help you with things outside of COVID-19 or things that feel outside of COVID-19 situation, but actually will help with the other aspects. So it could be going straight back and starting a new business plan, starting from scratch. We're in a new system now. Maybe there's other ways that as a business you can expand during this lockdown period. We can also be helping with any cash flow forecasts, be that making a decision whether to furlough yourself or not, or actually to be able to make any applications for any loans that you've decided you're going to take up that are currently available. So we're here to help as much as we can with anything that we can. It's just one of those things at the moment that, you know, everyone's starting to calm down a little bit, but people are still understandably worried, and we are here to try and help that side of things. So going on from there, I do believe we've now moved on to the question and answer section. So I shall pass you back over to the wonderful Laura, because I'm sure there are lots that have come through. I'll be honest, guys, I've been ignoring them because it's really easy to get distracted during these things.
Yes, thank you very much, Edith. Thank you very much, Alf. You are correct. We'd already had some questions through before the webinar started. We've had another 14 and they're going up, I think, through the webinar. So if we get started on the ones that we received prior, before we do get started with that, I mentioned it at the start, but as well as Alf and Edith, to give Edith a slight break, we've also got one of the senior accountants, or one of our senior accountants, Andrew Brown, joining us. I'm sure Sally always would say in the early webinars we do this week, there's no picture for him, but he's a very dashing young man. I don't think it works quite as well when I say that, but never mind. So I'm going to start with some questions that Paul sent in, and I'm going to address them to Andrew. So Paul said, with new start employees, if they were contracted partially during February, and their pay was calculated on a pro rata basis, should this be extrapolated to a full monthly amount for the benefit of the furlough 80% calculation for the ongoing months?
Thanks, Laura. As far as we're aware, if the employee is employed for less than 1 year, you claim the average of the monthly earnings since they started working. So if they started in February 2020, you would use the prorated earnings to the date at which they were paid.
Lovely, thank you. The next question from Paul was, how do the changes in the national minimum wage, which comes into effect on 6th of April, affect the averaging in relation to the furlough calculations for employees who are at the national minimum wage minimum?
Yeah, Edith did cover it in her presentation, but just for completeness, I'll answer it now as well. So if they are not working and that they are furloughed, then national minimum wage is not applicable. You pay 80% of the salary, and if that's minimum wage, then you will pay 80% of minimum wage. However, as Edith pointed out, if they're training, then they are deemed to be working, and therefore they do need to actually be paid national minimum wage. So do be careful if you do have any furloughed employees, and whilst they aren't working technically for your business and they're training, that the national minimum wage still does apply.
Lovely, thank you. And then the final question from Paul. I'm getting conflicting views on the definition of on payroll. Is it employees who were within a submitted payroll run for February and its associated RTI, or is it the contracted date of employment, which would include any employees who were engaged towards the end of February, say in the last week, who missed the payroll run for February and had an overpayment in March? Are they also eligible for the furlough grant?
So Paul's completely right on this one. It's a very tricky area. The truth is, HMRC have not really released enough details to make that call. They keep using the 28th of February as a date, even though there's 29 days in February this year. They do say that employees hired after the 28th of February can't be furloughed. So with that in mind, it's suggesting that if they were hired before the 28th of February, even if they weren't paid, that they would still qualify for this. However, there's not enough information either way to ascertain that. Potentially when they release the portal, there may actually be a way to have a concrete answer on that. But for the time being, you will get conflicting arguments because there is no HMRC definition of what classifies as February payroll, whether it means RTI, whether it means hired, or whether it means that they actually need to be on the books at that time.
Alf's looking like he wants to say something. I'm just checking.
No, I'm just listening with enthusiasm.
Excellent. So next, I think we'll probably pass to Edith. I think probably more so than Alf. This is from Michael. Hi, I have an employee who does around 30 jobs per month. Since COVID, we haven't received any new instructions, but I might expect the odd one or two to come in. It seems that a condition of furlough is that she does no work. Is there any workaround where she can do an occasional job? So,
first of all, thank you for the question, Michael. The first point to make is obviously you cannot work whilst you're furloughed. You can train, but that's categorically very different to working. The workaround as such, and I will use these bunny ears, the workaround, is that work needs to be delayed so that there's at least a minimum 3-week furlough period. But there is no way that you can let her work during that 3-week period. So that would be the workaround, as you wait for that 3-week period to finish. Even if she only does work for 2 days and then furloughed straight after again, you've still got to have that 3-week minimum period of furlough.
Thank you, Edith. I'm going to ask you this one. As I think the fact is you've probably already answered the question, but from Kevin, we understand the principle of how this will work, but in reality, if we answer the phone, emails to try and help customers, can we still claim to be furloughed?
At the end of the day, as long as you're not taking the calls and the emails to generate a sales invoice, it could be argued that you are doing it in the best interests for the business and promoting the health of the business. So it's very much that you could be answering them, but as long as you're not actually generating any income.
Lovely. And then we've kind of talked around the hopping in and out of furlough, which Peter's asked, but he's also asked, and I think this one is for Alf, do you think there will be any changes in the law regarding holiday entitlement?
No. I think the government has been more than generous already, offering to pay 80% of people's wages. You're not going to get any extra holiday out of them, in my view.
Okay.
I don't see why you need it.
I guess it's more so whether the holiday entitlement might get stripped back a bit, Alf, because obviously if we've got a period of 3 months where holidays are accruing and they can't take it because they're in furlough, or at least the employer and the employee choose not to, carrying that forward for 2 years, that's a lot of holiday for employees to take. So I wonder whether what Peter's asking is whether HMRC will somehow strip back the entitlement. But again, I know what you're going to say, but
No.
I suspect that could be what they're asking.
Yeah. No, the statutory minimum annual leave entitlement is 28 days per year. 4 weeks of that comes from European law, and the British government topped up with 1.6 weeks through English law. That's the law of the land. It's going to take something huge to change that, and I can't see anything happening to alter that. I can see, just as a side issue, some employers who are very generous in giving more than a statutory minimum. They might be thinking of stripping back if the contract allows, or if they had agreement. The statutory minimums won't be stripped back. And certainly HMRC won't be able to do it.
Thank you. It's another question for Alf from Sally. What if no employment contract currently exists? How do you vary the terms in that case?
Well, first of all, there's always a contract in place. What probably is in place is an oral contract. And sometimes we find there's a mixture between an oral contract and a written contract, where there's something like, for example, a offer letter, and the rest of the terms have been agreed orally. But without a right to vary the pay, an employee is going to have some difficulty. My advice would be to get the contract in place even now, even if it should have been issued years ago. You can still do it now. We did this the very same thing for a client about a week and a half ago. They'd had contracts with us 12 years ago. I won't say who you are. 12 years ago we gave them a contract, never been issued. So we issued new ones a week and a half ago, got them signed, and within 2 days, everybody was varied and placed on furlough. Okay.
That's cool. I'm pretty sure we've already answered this question during the course of the webinar, but I'm going to ask it anyway, just for thoroughness. So Joanne has asked, I have an employee isolating for 3 months due to coronavirus. If she has chosen to take unpaid leave for this, can I then furlough her for our period of closure?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is no, in actual fact, unless she herself is what we call extremely vulnerable, or has received an NHS letter or text telling her to self-isolate. If she's one of those people, and provided that she's self-isolating in line with public health guidance, then she can be furloughed.
Lovely,
if she's just shielding somebody within a family who's vulnerable, no, she can't be furloughed.
Can I just ask a side question to that, Alf? Apologies, because I think I know who this has come from, so I know a bit more of a background. If they chose to self-isolate before the company was closed down due to COVID-19, the restrictions the government closed down, so they wouldn't be able to be furloughed at that point because they'd already opted to self-isolate. But if the company's closed down anyway, so there is no ability to work because they're in the sector where the government did a forced lockdown on them, would they then be able to furlough even though they're self-isolating? Have I made that clear?
I'm not sure if I followed that, to be honest with you. The concept of furlough, don't forget, let's go back to basics, is to prevent an employee from who would otherwise have been laid off or made redundant. So that's your starting point. Would this employee have been laid off or been made redundant? She self-isolated before all this started, is that right?
I'm not sure if she self-isolated before the firm, before the particular business was forced to close down. I'm not entirely sure. So that's what I'm asking, if there's a differentiation between self-isolating before the forced close down or after the forced close down.
Well, I think the question would be, was she on the payroll on 28th of Feb? She was. Was she at risk of layoff? Or has she been at risk of layoff since? Could well be. We don't know enough about it.
I think it's one of those that we're probably just going to have to take offline for the moment, as we still have quite a number of questions to get through.
These are the weird and wonderful scenarios we're facing.
Yeah. So we've got a question from Jamie, who says, can a part-time employee be furloughed whilst continuing to work full-time for another employer, or do they have to be furloughed by both in order to qualify for the scheme? Let's pass it to Andrew. Andrew's not had much to contribute to, or ask to him for a while, so go for it, Andrew.
Thanks, Sally. So if an employee has more than one job, each job is separate because the furloughing is to help the business support the employees. So for one business, they may have to furlough, the other business may not need to furlough. You don't need to qualify for both to get the 80%. However, from the employee's point of view, they will only receive the 80% furloughed, of course, from those businesses that they cannot work for due to COVID-19. So as I say, they could end up still being employed by employer A, who hasn't closed down and is continuing to work, but for employer B, be furloughed, and 80% of their salary from employer B is then covered. Like I say, it's for the business rather than employees. So if they have more than one job, it's on a per business basis.
Thank you, Andrew. So I think this one's for Alf, from Sean. If staff still accrue holidays whilst on furlough, can you provide more detail around how to enforce them to take holiday entitlement during this time?
Yeah, Regulation 15 of the Working Time Regulations 1998 allow employers to give instructions to employees to take annual leave during a particular period. The condition precedent on that is they have to serve a notice on the employee, and I would suggest a written notice is the best evidence of having served the notice. The notice has to be served twice as many days before the first day of annual leave as the number of annual leave days to be taken. So if you want somebody to take 5 days annual leave, you have to give them 10 days notice of it prior to the first day that you want them to take the leave. Okay?
Thank you. Edith, the next few I think I'm going to pass your way. So Bruce, once again, I think this has already pretty much been answered through the webinar, but can you confirm how casual/0 hour staff furlough would be calculated?
Yeah, of course. So as previously mentioned, but just for completeness, it is based on either their average earnings over the 1920 tax year, dependent on whether that be the full year if they've worked for you and contracted with you for the full year, or if they've only been contracted for part of the year but still employed by you on the 28th of February, then it's prorated for the period that they have worked for you. The other option would be if they've worked for you for longer than a year, it would be based on the amount that they would have earned this time last year, and it's the higher of those two calculations that you'd furlough.
Thank you. Then from Joanne, should we still pay monthly or for 3 weeks?
Should still pay monthly. Your pay frequency isn't affected by furloughing. And I'm sure Alf, you may be able to jump in here, but from what I understand, it's a minimum period of 3 weeks for furloughing, but I don't think it's in 3 week blocks. So I don't think it's stipulated 3, 6, 9. I think it could be 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks as such.
Yes, yes.
Lovely. And then a question from Paul with regards to the employer NI, how I think basically the question is with regards to paying directors' salaries, because with directors the employer's NI is cumulative in general, so effectively I think will that affect the employer's NI?
So the answer to that, Paul, is a question that I actually posed this morning to a variety of other accountants, because there's nothing actually written in any of the guidance about how to deal with the employment allowance aspect to the reclaim for the employer's national insurance, and in particular how the directors work. So my answer to that is there is no strict answer, but I can take that offline and talk to you in a bit more detail about those options. I'm sure Laura will be able to tell me afterwards which Paul it was that asked the question.
That's cool. I think one of our panelists, if that gives you a hand in terms of working out which Paul, that he's just said, I think he means employment allowance.
Yep, thank you. I will discuss with that Paul at a later stage offline.
Lovely. So the next question is for Andrew from Tony. If an employee works 4 days a week, but I only need her 2 days a week at present, but I want to pay her normal salary, can I claim back the 80% on half of her salary?
Unfortunately not. If the employee is working on reduced hours or reduced pay, they won't be able to apply for the scheme. There's no working at all for a 3-week period. So any working at all means you cannot be claiming to be furloughed. So as Edith said, it's either a case of bookending the work and doing and saying that there's no work for 3 weeks, but in week 4 there's a lot of work. Admittedly, not every business can do that. Or it's a case of saying, paying a reduced rate. You cannot make that employee both furloughed and doing 2 days a week, unfortunately.
Thank you, Andrew. So one for Alf from Anonymous. For those of us with the low salary, high dividend limited company director setup, is there any need to formally furlough or vary contracts, as I'd just be doing it for myself?
Well, the answer to that is yes, because the same provisions apply to those category of people. I drafted a letter only 2 days ago from a director to himself, placing himself on furlough. That way, there's no argument, is there? If you do it that way, you follow the rules, you're quite safe. And we forgot to just mention just a side issue on all of these answers, Laura. I'm sure all of your guests will know this, but it's important that people treat this as a discussion rather than as specific legal advice.
Yeah, agreed.
The answer to his question is yeah, he should write himself a letter.
That's cool. Thanks, Alf. So Bruce said, as Carthy's do our payroll, do we notify you who we have furloughed, and will you assist in our claim calculations? So the answer to both of those will be yes. Because the portal's not open in order to make the claims, we don't know how much extra work that there will be, and it may be that there would be additional fees to do those claim calculations. But it's very much going to depend, I say on a case-by-case basis, but when we know what will be involved in it. So Ryan, I'm going to read the question out and then I shall decide who I shall pose it to. Ryan says, as a sole director, am I able to furlough myself and allow my subcontractors to essentially run the business whilst I'm away? I ask as they have not fallen favourably within the government schemes, and I would like to continue working. Will I be allowed to raise invoices, take enquiries, etc., or will I need to pass the whole responsibility on? I don't mind. Who would like to take that one?
Well, I think Edith covered that, didn't you, Edith?
Yeah, so we're kind of in this really fun world here where basically you're passing on the company's responsibilities to subcontractors. Now, subcontractors are not employees, so they fall outside of this furlough system altogether. Those subcontractors will have their own support systems from the government. To be brutally honest, my gut instinct is, are you really giving them more responsibility than they should have as a subcontractor? Because who's actually going to control them if you're furloughed? Because realistically, you should be controlling them. And I'm sure my colleague Andrew and Laura, by all means, jump in at any point here, because it's not actually a question I was prepared for. I'm just getting a message off Andrew that he is in agreement with me. But my gut instinct is no, you wouldn't be able to furlough yourself.
I'll jump in as well, Edith, if you don't mind. If those people are truly self-employed subcontractors, which I'll be bold enough without knowing anything else to say I doubt they will be, but if they were self-employed, why on earth would you want them to run your business? They'll take it off you, wouldn't they, if they were true self-employed people? And the answer is also wrapped up in the fact that if they're close enough for you to think that they could run your business, they're not going to be self-employed people. It's a very high hurdle to demonstrate somebody is truly self-employed in these situations. So be careful out there.
Thanks, everybody. Edith, I'm going to throw this one at you because I think you're probably it sounds very payroll-y. What about earnings attachments for maintenance payments?
Oh, well, I would imagine that still needs to come out of the furloughed amounts. Obviously, the government won't be covering that for you, but it would be payments taken out of your employees' net pay anyway. I can't foresee, and maybe Alf knows this from a background for the legality side, why that would suddenly stop. So I'd imagine they still need to be taken out.
Yes, I agree with Edith. Although
Thank you.
she's the expert.
Kevin, a lot of these questions are very similar. I do apologise. I'm just reading them out as I go. But as a company with 3 employees, 2 of which are directors, can we answer phone, email queries whilst furloughed? I have a feeling that might be the Kevin that sent the initial query as well. So I think we've pretty much answered that.
I think the basic rule is if a director is going to furlough himself, he's limited to undertaking his fiduciary duties only as a director rather than doing any actual work. That would be the safest way to run it.
Lovely. Question from Ben. Does a written notice have to be issued when furloughing an employee? Which I believe we've already kind of clarified. Yes, the answer is.
Well, the answer basically, you need his agreement to vary his contract, and without a written document, you're into an argument whether you agreed to it or not. So get it in writing. If it's not in writing, Ben, it didn't happen.
That's cool. And obviously, if you do need any support with that, Alf is there. Mm-hmm. There was more questions, but I can see that we've answered those ones. Once again, Joe said, I've put staff on furlough. Do they need to sign a declaration for this? The answer is yes. Get something in writing and get it done soon. Oliver has said, hi Laura, can you still attend networking meetings whilst on furlough? Where's the general position on that? Because I suppose networking is marketing.
Yeah, that's the thing. Networking nowadays, it's more or less a full-time occupation for some people. And it comes back to the same thing, is it work? If it's not work, then you can do it. If it is work, you can't do it.
Some directors don't actually do anything in regards to the sales output, and that their whole job is networking. So it's very tough to then say that your job doesn't include networking, and therefore if you are networking, you could be deemed to be working anyway, regardless.
Yeah, my position on it would be actually it's quite an active marketing. It's not just having something in the background. You are actively promoting, and I think you're edging more on the side that actually you can't be furloughed if you're doing that, as opposed to if you were just maintaining the Facebook page to keep it active, etc. But I guess it's a decision that you'd have to make for your own risk, really.
That's cool. And question from Bridget. Although our shops are closed, I can't do my normal work. I will still have to pay the wages and do paperwork, which will take about an hour a week. Can I still furlough myself? I think a lot of them are kind of from directors in terms of to what extent can I undertake work for the company.
So Bridget, my advice to you would be you could still furlough, mainly because I know your background, because I don't believe we have many Bridgets, and I'm pretty sure I know which Bridget's talking here. So as long as you're only running the payroll as an act of due diligence, realistically, because you've got to pay your staff, you've got to do your bookkeeping as part of your, again, statutory duties to keep your company in good order. So I can't see why you couldn't continue doing that side of it and be furloughed.
I agree.
Thank you both. I'm conscious of time, and there is a question from Barbara, but Barbara's no longer online, so I'll touch base with her separately. Then there's some questions from Philip. If your business operates on a pro forma basis and a quote was raised before the 28th of February, but the client didn't pay until today, for example, then how does direct furloughing work, especially as given as suppliers are closed, so goods cannot be dispatched before May?
The problem is the work is being done right now. The fact that the quote was raised in February doesn't mean that the work is being done in February. That's just the way, obviously, this business is structured, that the work gets done after a pro forma invoice is raised. Again, from HMRC and the government's point of view, I think they would consider you working, even if today you're trying to chase suppliers and stuff like that, you would still be working. I don't think you would be able to qualify as furloughing, although again, if Edith or Alf, if anything, or Laura, any other comments either way. But
I was going to say that the comment directly underneath it was just to clarify my previous question. There are only 2 directors, no other employees, and I suppose the question, I kind of am inclined to agree with Andrew that it does sound like work is being undertaken, but I suppose from your perspective, maybe you could consider whether it would take both of you to do that work. And whether
you can furlough one employee and have one director, and have one work. If that is exactly what's happening, as in one isn't working or unable to work, and one can, because there isn't enough work for 2 directors, you can do that.
Thank you, Andrew. So where are we at? Hang on a second. Sorry, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So Philip's just sent another message that says no work doesn't get started until suppliers start working again. So effectively, if you're not being in a position where you're able to undertake any work, then it kind of sounds like potentially you may have the ability to furlough then. Timothy says, do you have to have a minimum number of employees retained, or can the complete firm be furloughed for 3 weeks and then one person take off furlough for a week so that invoices, bills are paid and office work updated, etc.?
The answer to the first bit is there's no number. You can furlough all or 1, 2 or part of them. You can't unfurlough them until the end of the 3-week period. The difficulty you're going to have then is who do you choose to unfurlough to get back into work for a week? You've got to be careful of discrimination on that front. But you can do it.
Lovely, thank you. So we've got 2 questions left from that perspective. So from Anonymous, do we expect this portal to actually be ready, open in readiness for the April payroll? There is a growing concern that this portal will not actually be working. What's your best guess?
Well, we've been told it will be, that's all we can say.
Yeah.
We've also been told that the government's going to expect to be able to test 100,000 people a day. That's what they're saying.
I think, yeah, I suppose we've only got the official party line, really. Who knows? And then Michelle, the final question. So we have 2 directors and are looking to furlough 1 due to children homeschooling. How best should we process this furlough, and what communication evidence should be done? I think probably speaking to Alf is probably the best bet on that one.
Well, again, you've got a risk of discrimination. It's there. It's probably a hypothetical risk because 2 directors, I'm sure, should be happy to. I was
going to say they're also husband and wife, if that helps.
Well, I've been in tribunal with father and son against each other.
Okay,
and I've had a tribunal case with brother and sister against each other. But yeah, point taken. So yeah, just simple. You furlough whichever one agrees to be furloughed. Vary the contract properly. No problems at all.
Lovely.
One thing I would add in there, is obviously you need to be making sure you're furloughing the one that isn't working. That's the big differential. Yes. Is that Michelle's mentioned that one will do the childcare, one will do the work, but it's making sure you don't then cross over partway through that 3-week period.
Agreed. Lovely. We've had no more questions coming through. I'm conscious that we've now done just an hour, almost an hour and a quarter. So I think at this stage we'll draw it to close. I'd like to say thank you very much to Alf for joining us, to Edith and for Andrew for answering the questions as well. I think, Edith, did you just have something quickly to mention at the end in terms of for people who do have questions?
Yeah, so for those that have questions, any further information, obviously the legal side, the HR queries need to be directed towards Alf. You've got his email address on there. Any financial side or additional business support that you need from ourselves, if you're one of our clients, please just contact your usual client relationship manager or any contact you have within Carthy's. If you're not a client, there's an email address on there for you to actually email, and they'll be diverted to the appropriate person. But I think the main thing to take away from all of this really is that you really need to have an employment contract in place, and it needs to be up to date. There should be employment contracts for directors. They often seem superfluous to needs, but actually you may need to rely on them in future situations if there's ever a fallout between directors. And we have all seen at some time or another in our professional lives, directors fall out and it does get messy. Having those contracts in place do protect you. You are again in a prime position at the moment where you've actually got the details for someone that is very good at helping set up those contracts. So we'd highly recommend Alf and his team. So do utilise the fact that you've now got contact points with Alf there. Make that contact, get them in place. On a tax side note, the costs for sorting out the contracts, it's tax allowable costs. So, you know, some tax saving opportunities there too, guys.
Well done, Edith.
Thanks very much, Edith. So yes, miscellaneous other point, just before we finish, we've obviously run 3 webinars now, which have all gone down really quite well with everybody that's attended them. It's something that now we've started, we don't want to stop, and especially during this quiet period, if clients are thinking that there is something that they would like to go through and would like us to get set up, whether it's us running it or whether it's finding somebody else to be able to do that for you, then please do just let us know. And yeah, I think that's it. Have a good weekend, everybody. Enjoy the weather. I think it's supposed to be nice this weekend.
Stay home.
Thank
All
you.
the best.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe, everyone.
Yeah.